Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us here today. When we planned this event, we did not anticipate that it would be a very pleasant coincidence, if you will. So as we speak, the U.S. Census Bureau is releasing its apportionment numbers, and we have folks on the team that have split screens to see if there's any news coming out in terms of what it means for California and its apportionment. I'm Karthick Ramakrishnan. I direct the Center for Social Innovation. I'm a professor at University of California, Riverside. Specific to the census, I was the director of the Census Complete Count Committee in the Inland Empire, which, as I like to say, is about the size of the state of South Carolina, both in terms of geography and population. But I guess we'll find out soon enough where we stand with respect to the state of South Carolina. Well, I guess not quite yet. We'll find that out later on this year for the Inland Empire. Really thrilled to have all of you here, and really looking forward to learning from all of the experts here that will be joining us shortly. We have Assemblymember Berman here as our special guest. He chairs the Assembly Select Committee on the Census that just got renewed and is doing important work in terms of learning and evaluation from the census, and especially with respect to planning for an even stronger census in 2030. So I want to toss it over to Assemblymember Berman, who's going to provide some initial remarks.
Thank you, Karthick, and really good to be here. Appreciate the invitation and opportunity, and great to see everybody. I see a lot of old friends, people whose paths have crossed over the last couple of years as we've all been working on the census. It's been a while, actually, since I've presented or talked about the census, so I might be a little rusty, but here it goes. I can't overemphasize just how important the census is to every aspect of society and all levels of government in California. Not only does the census determine how many members of the House come from California, but the population numbers also inform representation at all levels of government. And accurate data means that elected representatives will reflect our population and ensures that the diverse interests of that population are represented. Equally as important, especially during trying times like a global health pandemic, the census is also about funding. Accurate census data brings billions of dollars of federal funds into California and allows us to make investments in California that reflect our values. As if the pressure weren't already high enough due to the importance of achieving a complete count, the challenges facing the 2020 census were unlike any previous count. The federal government was way behind on preparations for the census, was not prepared to make the same level of investment in the requisite outreach to hard to count communities. And the administration at the time was looking at, I'll say, creative ways to change how and who we count. And by creative, I mean they were unconstitutional. The odds were heavily stacked against California, so much so that the early conversations were not focused on whether California would lose seats in the House of Representatives for the first time in history. It was about how many seats California would lose. And as Karthick mentioned, we'll find out any minute now. I'll hope that we don't lose any, but there's a chance we might. With stakes that high and so many challenges, we knew it was critically necessary to make an unprecedented investment both in people and money, to make sure that every Californian was counted. In fact, it's a funny story, but it was the fall after my first year in the Assembly. It was 2017. I just got elected. I just finished my first year in the Assembly. I was back home over break, and I get a call from the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon. And the Speaker is now a good friend of mine. Back then, I was just starting to get to know him, and needless to say, he didn't call me every day. But he called me out of nowhere one day and he said, hey, the census is coming up in a couple of years and California might get, for lack of a better term, screwed. And so we really need to start focusing on the census now. The Speaker was on vacation in, I think, like the Mediterranean, like he was on vacation with family halfway around the world when this idea had popped into his head. And he called me as chair of the elections committee to tell me how concerned he was. So to get a head start on these challenges and begin working with partners in the nonprofit and philanthropic communities, the Assembly and the Senate created Census Select Committees in early 2018, and the Speaker appointed me to chair the effort on the Assembly side. While the public-facing work of the committees came in the form of a series of joint hearings that were held in Sacramento and across the state, much of the heavy lifting happened behind the scenes. My counterparts in the Senate and I regularly spoke at forums to increase awareness and encourage activism. We worked closely with our colleagues in the legislature to advocate with Governor Brown and then Governor Newsom for dramatically more funding than ever before. And then we worked with the administration, both administrations, on spending plans to ensure appropriate accountability and transparency. And my staff and I were in constant contact with community leaders, the philanthropic community, and so many others to identify and develop trusted messengers, share information, and do our best to support the efforts underway. And I bet everyone on this Zoom today has spoken or emailed with Chris Wagaman from the Speaker's office, who was my point person in all of these efforts. Even though the census enumeration is complete, and as Karthick mentioned, both the Assembly and Senate Census Select Committees were renewed for the current session. As part of the accountability and transparency I just mentioned, the state-funded effort is required to report to the legislature on all census-related efforts. And we intend to use that report and potentially additional oversight conversations to develop a roadmap for 2030. Just as the 2010 report informed 2020, the 2020 report will help inform 2030. Additionally, there are efforts underway through academia and philanthropy to evaluate what worked well in the lead up to 2020 and where there could be improvements. That work will also help inform the 2030 plans. And the work of community-based organizations and foundations really set a standard that we can only hope to see again 10 years from now in 2030, I guess 9 years from now in 2030. So while the census may have ended months ago, much more work remains. And I know that's why we're all here today. And I look forward to hearing from the experts that are on the panels to come.
Thank you, Assemblymember, and really appreciate your longstanding leadership in this area. And it's part of the work. So not only am I the director of the Center for Social Innovation, I'm the founder with Karla Lopez Rio, who we'll be hearing from later on today, who's our associate director of Census Legacies. And it's precisely that notion of making sure that the fundamental lessons of census in terms of how to do community partnerships, how to do these public-private partnerships with philanthropy and government, recognizing the expertise and lived experience of community leaders and communities as partners in the work has been so powerful. And we really hope that we can keep that momentum going. I'm going to keep quiet now and turn it over to Ben Christopher from CalMatters, who will lead us through a moderated conversation.
Thank you so much, Karthick. Really appreciate it. And like you said, I think, I knew that this was going to be a timely conversation. I think we all knew that, but I don't know if we knew just how timely it was going to be. As we speak, the Census Bureau is releasing its new population estimates from the 2020 census. I believe we're still waiting on those data, but this is obviously going to have a potentially profound impact on political representation in California, on the shape of the electoral map, how much fiscal support Californians get from Washington, D.C. compared to other states. And so we have three experts to talk about all of that right now. And first, I want to introduce Dr. Hans Johnson. Dr. Johnson, welcome.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Johnson is the director of the PPIC Higher Education Center and also a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, where he holds the Thomas and Marilyn Sutton Chair in Higher Education Policy. And as the center director, he works with a team of researchers to identify policies that can make higher education policy more successful and more sustainable. So thanks so much for taking the time, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I hate to put you on the spot, but I think the Census Bureau has conspired to put you on the spot by releasing its data exactly now. But we have these new data coming out today. And obviously there's a lot of focus on just this top line figure of, is California going to lose a seat? And so are we going to lose a seat? And if so, what did we do to deserve this? What contributes to this outcome? Can you kind of just walk us through how this math works out?
Sure, and just in real time here, it looks like they did release the number for California. If I'm
You're on.
watching the webcast correctly, California came in at 39,538,000. Just for point of comparison, that's about 200,000 more than the Census Bureau said California had in July 1st, 2020, according to their estimates. And it's about 200,000 lower than what the Department of Finance said California had on July 1st, 2020. And what that, and sorry, I don't mean to geek out here too much, but this is an exciting time for demographers and for California, and a meaningful time for the reasons that Assemblymember Berman already mentioned. The national population grew actually a few million more than what the Census Bureau had estimated. And I think what that means, and they're doing the seat increase right now, but I think what that means is almost certainly California lost a seat. And this will be the first time we lost a seat ever in a census. And the reason for that is pretty clear to me as a demographer, and that's our population did not grow as fast as that in the rest of the country. And of course, as we know, the number of seats that a state gets is determined based on its population. Every state gets at least one, and then beyond that, it depends on how large your population is. And then the change in the number of seats from one census to the next depends on how fast you grew relative to the rest of the nation. It's a fixed pie. And California did not grow as fast as the rest of the nation. We grew at a rate of a little over about 5.5%. The rest of the nation grew well over 7%, according to the numbers that are in just now. Yeah, okay, and they just showed us we lost a seat. So
Breaking news, there we go.
breaking news right there. So why did California not grow as fast as the rest of the nation? I mean, I think that's a longer answer. I don't think the undercount was the reason why we see these numbers. California extended a great deal of effort to improve our count. And unless there was a huge differential undercount, we're not going to know that for at least a year. That's probably almost certainly not the reason why. The main reason why is that the determinants of population growth, which are births, deaths, and migration, and then we break that into international and domestic, all were lower than they had been in previous decades. And while domestic migration, that is interstate migration between California and the rest of the United States, gets a lot of news, and justifiably in some ways, we have every decade for the last 3 decades, we've lost more than 1 million people to other states than we've gained from those states. But those numbers on a decennial basis haven't changed that much in 30 years. What has changed is international migration slowed this decade. Births slowed quite a bit this decade. We have the lowest birth rates that we've ever had in California right now. And the number of deaths actually went up as the population was aging. So all of those things combined lead to this lower population growth in California. And then finally, I do want to say, when we talk about, and the focus on why so many people are leaving California to move to other states, it's primarily about economics and cost of living. And we've done a lot of work at PPIC looking at who's leaving and who's coming to California. And there's a huge difference. For example, California exports poverty. We lost about 600,000 people who were in poverty or near poor in the last decade. And at the same time, we gained about 100,000 people who lived well above the poverty level, 5 times or more above the poverty level. We gain college graduates, we lose less educated individuals. And so much of that is driven by high housing costs in California. And that's where you get the stories about, the California dream being dead or no longer affordable. And I think there's some truth to that. And I think one of the challenges that California faces right now is how we build more housing to accommodate the strong demand that continues to exist among people who want to live in our state.
Right. And so, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit about this idea of this narrative of the California exodus, people leaving the state for more economically vibrant places like Texas and Florida. And as a reporter, I'm already imagining the headline that we're going to see probably in papers across the state this afternoon and tomorrow of California in decline. But as a demographer, what are you going to be looking at within these numbers, just aside from that top line? And what is this all going to tell us about the future of the state?
Yeah, and I think, the big picture here is California's population growth has been slowing for a long time. But now we've hit this level where we're actually growing slower than the rest of the country. We're still growing. And by the way, some states aren't, but we're still growing. And so the question I think though becomes for California is how we ensure that Californians are successful and achieving their educational and economic aspirations in a state that doesn't have strong population growth. And there are examples, and I think in some ways California is at the forefront again demographically. So we were at the forefront of population growth for a long time. Now we're experiencing a different kind of slowdown than other states have. So a lot of the Rust Belt states, for example, have had population slowdowns and even declines for decades. And economically, they haven't done very well. In California, as I said, we don't have low-cost housing like states like Ohio and Illinois and Michigan, which have had population losses in some of those places. What we have instead is a strong demand that's not being accommodated by housing supply. So I think going forward, housing has to be critical in terms of how California responds. And then in terms of economic and educational mobility, we've done a lot of work at PPIC looking at how California needs to ensure that it provides more access and more completion for students who transition from high school into college. And there's some really good news there, and Assemblymember Berman is actually on the forefront of some of that. But in terms of then the census numbers, and sorry, I'll wrap it up here. What we'll be looking for is how the population changed within the state. We know a lot more people are moving from, for example, the Bay Area to Sacramento than are moving from the Bay Area to out of state. And so we'll be looking at some of that, and that will have implications for reapportionment of California's own legislature in terms of the districts. And then we'll be looking at the characteristics of the population. We'll be looking at those numbers both to see do the census numbers, when we get those more detailed numbers, which won't be until the summer or late this summer, do those numbers match up with what we think we know? Again, from demographic analysis, for example, we know births, we know deaths, we know the racial and ethnic composition of those. Do these numbers make sense in light of that? But the top line number is not surprising. It's pretty much in between what the Census Bureau and Department of Finance had estimated. And I think the big picture for California going forward then is how are we a productive state that has a high quality of life for the residents who live here and not just for the rich.
Right. Well, thank you for all that. And thanks for being a good sport, being put on the spot like that. We are very lucky to have an in-house demographer expert to sort of unpack this news that is breaking right now. I want to bring in our next panelist, Tara Westman. Is a senior program manager with the California Endowment, which is a statewide private health foundation. She also serves as the co-chair of the California Census 2020 Funders Initiative, which is a philanthropic collective dedicated to an accurate count and the improvement of opportunities and conditions for Californians who have been politically and economically and socially marginalized. Tara Westman, thanks so much for being here on this exciting day.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for including me in today's program. It's a pleasure to be here as a representative of the California Endowment, as a health foundation that supports the voice and power of people who are often excluded from decisions that affect their lives. We see the census as an important pillar of democracy. The census is a chance to be seen, to shape representation and power, and to ensure that elected leaders represent the interests of everyone in their districts. The census also brings important federal resources to communities across the state for essential programs in health, education, housing, and infrastructure. Roughly 11% of the $1.5 trillion that are distributed by the federal government each year come to California, and these dollars are tremendously important to the health of Californians. Also, census data underlies much of the data that we use and that others rely on to plan, to understand trends related to health, the economy, and the status of people and communities. So building on our experiences in 2000 and 2010, we focused on people considered hard to count by census experts, which includes African Americans, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander populations, urban and rural low-income households, renters, young children, people experiencing homelessness, as well as immigrant and LGBTQ communities. Because these populations are really at the core of our grant making, there was great congruency between the communities that we serve and those most likely to be missed in the census count. And we had partners who were poised and ready to organize and implement culturally appropriate strategies that would reach people considered hard to count. We also knew that there were serious challenges, as Assemblymember Berman so accurately laid out. There were serious challenges to participation in 2020, which necessitated a very comprehensive plan of support for a fair and accurate count. We're a very large and diverse state, making the decennial census a challenge under any circumstances, but specific to 2020, in addition to challenges at the Census Bureau, funding, leadership, operational changes, we had a federal government generating harsh and exclusionary policies directed at alienated the most vulnerable people and communities in California. And this added a lot of reluctance and fear among people who had every right to be included in the census. And so our goal was to ensure that Californians knew that everyone counts and to participate because we all belong and we all matter. Our solution was to work in collaboration with other philanthropic organizations and with the public sector. It takes all of us to have a successful census, and we really wanted to do our part.
Thank you for that. And I wonder if we could just back up, because I think for a lot of people who aren't involved in this, they know that the census is something that the federal government does. So what leads a philanthropic organization to get involved with this? And also, can you just talk about how the pandemic maybe complicated some of the work that you were doing?
Sure. Well, the reason why we've done this, we've done it in the past. And as I mentioned, the funding and representation are really important. To us, it's a foundation that focuses on the power and voice of communities. That makes it very important for us to pay attention to this. We decided to work in tandem with 35 funders who supported community preparation, capacity building, education, communications, outreach, and just the get out the count phase. There was a lot of groundwork that needed to be laid, and we knew that there were many, many community groups that wanted to get involved. So across all of our philanthropic organizations, about 30 million was provided over the course of the census because of our collective interest in democracy and maximizing those resources to California, and because of the many populations that were likely to be undercounted. The pandemic had some really strong, I would just say, for us, being faced with a deadly pandemic certainly concentrates the mind, and it takes a lot of the attention away from everything else. And the fact that the census landed all of those questionnaires that were mailed out to households across the state started the week that we started sheltering in place. And so there was a tremendous effort on the part of our partners to pivot and to ensure that they had ways of reaching community members that were different than what they had planned pre-pandemic. And it was really witnessing how this vast network of organizations made those pivots so that they could continue to be trusted messengers that made a tremendous difference to how the count went in California. And they had extraordinary commitment, leadership, ingenuity, and persistence. And many of them combined their efforts with COVID outreach in order to reach people who, for top of mind, the census was not top of mind, for them. And what we've seen since that time is that these very same community organizations showed their ability to reach people. And so now the public sector continues to partner with them for vaccine outreach, for COVID education, And we are truly fortunate to have this robust set of community-based leaders and organizations in California, because they made the difference for us, both for the census and in this pandemic.
Right. Well, I do want to hear about what those networks of connections and that infrastructure is going to be used for in the future. But first, I want to bring in our third panelist, Dr. John Dobard. Dr. Dobard is the Director of Political Voice at Advancement Project California, where he leads advocacy efforts to eliminate racial and economic disparities in political participation and in government responsiveness. So Dr. Dobard, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So Tara Westman was just talking about how so much of this work is about building trust with people, with community, because the census, I think, by definition, is about personal information. It can feel perhaps very invasive, particularly for folks who are not as familiar with the process. Can you talk about the work that you have been doing and your colleagues have been doing, and how you've been able to sort of build that trust?
Yeah, of course. So Advancement Project California is a racial justice organization, and we view the decennial census as a racial equity issue. Our interest in the issue is driven primarily by two concerns, and I think we've heard some of those, so I'll kind of be reiterating a bit of that. So what drives us is, one, the longstanding problem of people of color being undercounted, particularly those in low-income neighborhoods. And we're also driven by the political and economic implications of that problem. So in other words, the ways in which the undercount prevents those communities from receiving the political representation and federal resources that they need to thrive. So for the 2020 census, we played primarily three roles, similar to 2010. We served as a data provider. We provided research and data support to the California Native Vote Project, the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, and the We Count LA Census Table to assist their outreach efforts. We also served as a convener. We co-convened the We Count LA Census Table, which was established to facilitate coordination among CBOs on outreach across LA County. And that effort involved over 100 organizations. We also convened and helped establish the Census Policy Advocacy Network, or CPAN, which is a diverse coalition of statewide organizations working to educate policymakers and community leaders about the government investment and sound policies needed to achieve a fair and accurate count of all Californians. And then finally, and this differs from anything we did in 2010, we played an advocacy role. So again, we convened and helped establish CPAN, and CPAN's work is really focused on the policy side of the census in contrast to the field outreach side. So we really thought it was important to do that policy work in addition to providing whatever support we could to trusted messengers as they engaged in field outreach.
Gotcha. And obviously, the focus of today's news is going to be just how it relates to how many congressional seats California will have. Looks like we're going to have 52 instead of 53, but obviously this is about more than just congressional seats, and this is going to inform the redistricting process, which needs to get done before the end of this year. And I know there's some concern particularly from the election folks that I've been speaking to, about whether they're going to have time to do that in time for the next election, 2022. But what kind of work will you be doing to prepare for all of that? Yeah.
So similar to the census, we view redistricting as a racial equity issue. It's also a racial equity issue, given our country's and our state's lengthy history of using redistricting to politically disempower people of color, again, particularly low-income people of color. And similar to our census work, we're serving as a data provider, a convener, and an advocate. And I think you alluded to what is the biggest issue right now, or the biggest concern right now, which is the release of the Census Bureau's redistricting data. So today is about the release of apportionment data. We are deeply concerned about the release of the redistricting data, specifically what's known as the Public Law 94 redistricting data. And the Census Bureau usually releases that data by April 1st of the year following the decennial census, which would have been April 1st of this year. However, due to some of the issues that were already mentioned, the Bureau had to shift that deadline to September 30th. The Bureau recognizes that September 30th deadline may cause burdens for some states. And so it's offered to release what it calls legacy format summary data. And it says it can release that by August, instead of September. The issue with that data set is that it's not tabulated and therefore isn't in user-friendly form. And so what the Bureau has said is we'll give states, if you would like it, we'll give you this data, but you then assume the responsibility for tabulating it and making it user-friendly. The reason why all of this matters for California, or I'll say partially why it matters, and the reason why we're concerned, and many of our partners are, is because whether we receive one data set or the other will trigger different start dates for the state level commission's 4-month process for drafting and finalizing maps. And those different start dates have different implications for public participation. So for the ability of the public to participate in the process, as well as different implications for the 2022 elections calendar. So Advancement Project California is working in collaboration with many other partners to ensure that the commission arrives at the best solution.
Gotcha. And so at this point, if anyone who's watching has any questions, I would invite you to put those questions in the Q&A function. We're going to open it up to all three panelists. Dr. Johnson, just to go back to you, I mean, again, we're digesting this news that we're getting, and it looks like we're going to be having down from 53 to 52 seats. And it looks, if I'm reading this right, that Texas is going to get one of those seats, and again, feeding that rivalry. But you know, aside from the folks who really, you know, political reporters, demographers, advocacy folks, why does this matter? Why is this a big deal?
Well, you know, to some people, how fast a state grows is a measure of how well a state is doing. There are others who actually would prefer slower population growth. So population growth brings both challenges and opportunities. I think why it matters, and there's kind of a, if you want to call it a statewide psychological perspective of California kind of shifting gears from being this place where we always thought of as kind of go, 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 grow to a place where we're not that anymore. And as I've said, we haven't been that really for a few decades, but now we're seeing, compared to the rest of the nation, we're a slower growing state. I think, you know, John and Tara and the Assemblymember have already outlined why this matters so much on a real practical level and what it means for Californians in terms of how they're represented and what kind of allocations are made on the basis of population to improve the lives of Californians. And those are a big, you know, those are big consequences of any census, including this one. I will say that in the past, California has rebounded from slow growth and had faster growth. Remains to be seen whether we ever return to that again. And finally, I think it is incumbent on all of us to make sure that California succeeds for the people in California who have been left out of our economic growth. So some of those people who were left out have left the state, but many others remain here. Most people don't move across state boundaries. And so there needs to be, and we've worked, and all of us have worked on a number of these issues, but certainly educational opportunities, the path towards economic mobility still is through education. California has a robust system of higher education segments that are doing all kinds of things to improve access and completion. And there's some real success stories out there. The California State University and the California Community Colleges eliminated remediation, for example. And that led to dramatic increases in access to college level courses for students who were historically underrepresented in higher education in California, including Latinos and African American, low income and first generation students. So there's a lot out there that I think we need to be concentrating on as a state as we kind of digest both these numbers and what they mean for us from a bigger perspective.
And we just got a question from Joe Long here, which is asking whether we know at what how granular the data is. Will we know which counties are going to be growing the most, or where a potential congressional seat might get taken away? Do we know that yet?
Not yet.
Okay, so we'll have to wait and see. Tara Westman, I wanted to come back to you because we had been talking about these networks of partnerships that you've been developing over this last year or two, and the sort of infrastructure. And now that we have at least the preliminary data, what's next for you and for all this work?
Well, we are continuing to look at census issues. We, like many, we want to watch the quality indicators and to watch to see how that is judged over the coming months and years. So we'll continue to watch how the Census Bureau does that, but also some independent experts and what they think about, those numbers. We'll also be paying attention to how our partners are thinking about census on an ongoing basis. We had many more organizations involved in the census this time around, and so we'll be remaining attuned to any census related activities that they may be getting involved in. For example, we know in these next 5 years, there will be a focus on what questions will be in the census questionnaire. And so the ability to shape those questions to be appropriate for all the populations who complete the census is critically important. How counts are done, there will be some operational decisions about that. And then we also want to make sure that we don't stop paying attention such that we end up having to start over again, 7 years from now. So what we'd like to do is remain attuned to that so that we can better prepare for the ramp up that's necessary for the next decennial census, however that will be carried out. I also just want to say this is so hand in glove with our commitment over the next 10 years to provide enduring commitments to marginalized communities and the leadership of residents and youth to build and exercise power that contributes to greater health and racial equity. So it's important that we continue to nurture democracy and the inclusion of people who aren't well represented in the halls of power and whose voices are often marginalized. And so voting, there will be all kinds of civic engagement activities that these very same groups will be engaged in. And so it's our responsibility and our goal to continue to support that statewide network of power.
And when you mentioned that they're going to be thinking through about the next time around, because I guess 10 years just flies by, how the questions are asked operationally, how to reach out to people. Can you talk about what kinds of decisions are going to have to be made?
Yes, there is a race and ethnicity question, and there's been probably 30 years of advocacy about how to ask those questions so it's not as confusing. Right now, it's not terribly representative of all the various groups that are represented here in the United States. And so there have been also efforts to look at gender and how those questions ought to be addressed. And finally, how we count people who are incarcerated. There's what some people consider gerrymandering happening, where the counties where prisons are located receive the accounts of those people who are incarcerated rather than the home communities from which they come. And so, there are a lot of debates about how these things should be operated. And so we anticipate that many of our partners will be paying attention to this, over the next 10 years to ensure that the census is keeping up with what the population of California and the population of the United States really is.
Right. Dr. Dobard, I mean, Tara just mentioned the word gerrymandering, and I feel like in California, because we have this independent redistricting commission, maybe there's a thought that, well, we don't really need to worry about how these maps are drawn because they're going to be drawn in a fair and objective way. But you mentioned that one of the concerns here, particularly with this crunch time frame, is that there might not be enough time for the public input that really makes sure that this is done in a transparent and accountable way. Can you kind of talk about those concerns?
Yes, so we and many of our partners strongly believe that for our state to have those fair maps, the commission needs to hear from people. The commission needs to hear from community residents about how they understand their communities of interest, because they don't just have that knowledge. And that's part of why we have such a participatory process, is so that information can be gathered. So if there are limitations on the ability of community residents to share that information, the commission is going to be without a robust set of information that it needs to be able to draft the best maps that it can.
Right. And now I would imagine that now that there is going to be one fewer congressional district in the state, there's going to be, the stakes are that much higher for the redistricting committee, or the commission, I would imagine.
Indeed.
Yeah. And so I think we are coming up on the 12:45 time, but I just want to thank all three of you for taking the time to walk us through this, particularly today when we are getting the news and processing it in real time. And thank you again for all three of you for all the work that you do on this really important issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, so much for this wonderful moderation. My name is Karla Lopez Rio. I am with the Center for Social Innovation, and I am also the Associate Director for a project called Census Legacy. So I'm going to share my screen and tell you about a project that we want to put together, particularly important after the conversation we just had. I want to share a little bit about myself. Before coming to the Center for Social Innovation, I worked for the U.S. Census Bureau, particularly doing that 2020 census outreach in the region where I live in the Inland Empire. And although I'm happy to share with you that we surpassed the amount of self-response because of all the great research and commitment that there was for the undercount and the campaigns that were put together with the trusted messengers, our undercount probably is less than if we would have not done a real effort for counting people, and particularly those that lived in the most underserved and undercounted areas. Prior to that, prior to working for the Census Bureau, I worked in affordable housing. This just touched the nerve of how much I cared about the funding and the count, because it's not just about the federal funding from downstream. It's also the type of leveraging that we heard that you can do when you have the count and where you locate the housing and for whom you locate the housing. So census is extremely important and is the only way that we can really combat some of the most terrible things that are happening in our housing crisis here in California. So if we could share our screen, I would like to tell you about our 10-year roadmap to 2030, because it is time to get ready now. Believe it or not, we need to start getting ready for 2030 now. So what would success look like in 2030? What we thought about is that in 2030, we want to see high levels of community awareness, particularly for those young individuals that did not participate. I have a 16-year-old that did not fill out her census, but in 10 years, she will be in charge of making sure that she fills it out. And immigrants, I'm an immigrant. I was brought here when I was 15 years old, and there was no onboarding package for me. I had to figure out all of this on my own and with the support of my peers in my school. But census was something that was not very knowledge. I had no knowledge of how it worked, and it works different in different countries. So strong levels of awareness. We want to see increased self-response rates. We want residents to feel informed and know when they get that census form, not just that they have to fill it out, but what it means to their lives. What does it mean for them to fill out that census on a day-to-day basis? And we want to see an increased and deepened cross-sector and multi-level partnership. We had some of the most historical partnerships coming together for this goal. So if we go to the next slide, I would like to tell you about then Census Legacies. Census Legacies is an emerging network of funders, nonprofits, businesses, governments, and researchers from around the country. We are trying to repurpose census outreach tables to ensure that these historically undercounted communities have an equal voice in shaping the future of our regions. In the next slide, we're going to ask the question, so how do we best prepare? So I will tell you on the next slide that we came up with an idea. It's not so much of our idea, but we came up with an idea of a 10-year roadmap to 2030 census. And what this looks like is that we want to really make sure that we keep those tables together, that we grow them. They were called different things: complete count committees, local outreach tables, collaboratives. All of those are tables that were some of the most trusted messengers from the communities of the most undercounted or underserved areas sit and have the power to continue the work that they began in 2020 census outreach. So we were inspired by the Funders Committee on Civic Participation's document, was released about less than a month ago. It's called A Blueprint for Philanthropic Civic Engagement. And they provided national census partners a roadmap for the next 10 years on what to do every single year. So the Census Legacies partners with Census Legacies, such as the Leadership Conference, we are working together on putting together a matrix where all the people that need to get ready will have access to this roadmap, which will live on our website and will hopefully capitalize on this crowdsource of asking people, what does Congress need to do to be ready every year? What are the states, the counties, the cities, faith-based organizations, schools, community-based organizations, all of these and so many more, all of these trusted messengers, how do they get ready? Two very simple concepts that the roadmap explores. The very first one is that we want to make sure that we know the census milestones every year. Every year, census has certain type of activity and data releases or data collection or surveys going out. We want to know which of those affect your particular field or your particular population, that you're knowledgeable about it, and then that you have actions every year. So we created this very high level. This is nothing compared to what these one-pagers look like, but this is just a very high level of what it would look like for funders. For example, when the release of state population total for apportionment, like we are doing today, should we be getting together? What should we do around this data? Is it going to affect redistricting? What do we start mobilizing around this milestone? Another document that is in the works is, how do we preserve the information that was gathered? So one of the things that we have seen that is across the board important is keeping these networks together and the information of the people who were involved. So our record keeping is one of the top priorities for Census Legacies in 2021 for CBOs, for funders, for so many of us, for the state. I know that there are a lot of tests and a lot of quality data reviews at the moment. So all of those should be known by staff or by the community, that those are milestones that we want to reach, and so on and so forth. So as you see, these are just examples of different types of milestones and different types of actions that each of those sectors would have to take in order to be ready for the 2030 census. And we will be sharing this with the community. Please stay in touch with Census Legacies to learn about the roadmap, but not just to get the roadmap, to build the roadmap with us, to attend our meetings and to give your ideas of what were the challenges that you had and how do you plan to overcome them in the next 10 years. We hope that, I believe I'm going to hand it back to Karthick. We hope that you were able to get the information that you needed. I know there will be a lot of other questions that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. We would like to also open up for Q&A while we wait for Karthick to come on board and close us off. Oh, hey, Karthick.
Oh, but I think, no, yeah, I've been here for a few minutes, but Karla, I think it is Q&A even for you, if folks have any questions for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we will stop sharing our screen and we'll take questions from the audience. Let me look at our Q&A. So we have a Q&A here, a question from Maribel Nunez. And I believe the question is for all of us. So yes, racial equity in the partnerships when doing redistricting must also include people of color-led groups that include Latino, AAPI, African American, and Indigenous communities regarding redistricting. Maribel Nunez from the Inland Equity Partnership. Anybody would like to answer that question from the panelists?
I'm happy to comment on that. We are supporting Philanthropy California's Fair Redistricting Fund, and it is supporting statewide redistricting with the idea that, you know, in 2010, actually in the 2011 redistricting process, we had a really successful citizens-led commission process, and we wanted that to remain in place. And we wanted community groups to have a say in how community maps are drawn and how they are proposed to that commission. And so we're supporting this fund as our other funders. And it is supporting these very groups that Maribel has identified in her questions. So yeah, we're right in line with that.
Thank you. Karthik, do you have a thought?
Sure. No, I was going to say, folks, I mean, this is, I had to unfortunately toggle between two meetings, which I think is unfortunately or fortunately, you know, part of our reality in our Zoom worlds where we think we can be in two places at once, but only so much so. But from what I gathered from the beginning with Hans's work, and also just knowing, first of all, I should note with the different affiliations I have, I'm also a board member of the California Endowment and have known about Tara's work on census and leadership. But of course, it's not just about the endowment. You know, with our community partners and with other funders, it's been such an important priority. I just think that, you know, with the work that Advancement Project has done, both on census and continues, right? It's both, it's not just the advocacy work, it's the fundamental data, the research. We have a framework that we developed in our center a couple of years ago called DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And I think we're seeing that in practice today. I mean, we literally got data that came out, but then what does it mean in terms of narrative? What does this say about California in terms of what the last decade has meant? But importantly, I think from some of the stuff, at least what I heard Hans say, is just what does this mean for the future, right? It's not, the numbers don't speak for themselves. There's a lot behind the numbers, and it's important for us to have that understanding. And especially in terms of the understanding of communities and what they are going through, both in terms of their triumphs and celebrations, but also the challenges that they face. So we see census as, you know, one of those, census can mean so many different things. It is, when done right, you know, the most democratic act in the United States, right? In making sure that everyone is part of that system. You had some that tried to dilute what representation meant, that it wasn't one person, one vote, but somehow one citizen, one vote. I think we'll still continue to see those kinds of court challenges in the years to come. But it's something that is so important and precious that we have to safeguard. But it really, I think, opens up these much bigger conversation about what does representation mean? What does it mean to belong? And how can we make sure that we do everything possible? What Karla laid out was in many ways you know, very directly connected with census and how we can be prepared. But, you know, in terms of housing affordability, how do we make sure that everyone who wants to belong in California can belong in California? And I think that'll be the challenge, but I think also the opportunities ahead. And I just want to express deep gratitude for everyone here, from Hans at PPIC, you know, more traditionally kind of a think tank and not as embedded in the work per se, but still really helping a lot of community partners, including those in education, kind of figuring out how do we make sure that we invest in Californians for the long haul. And then, of course, Tara at California Endowment, and John, and then finally to Ben for moderating it. So I'll just leave it at that. It's just, and I don't want to just do a throwaway to Ben. I mean, CalMatters didn't exist in the last census, right? I mean, that's kind of new on the scene. And to have that kind of data and research and policy informed journalism is just so critical. I wish we had something like a CalMatters throughout every region of California. I mean, certainly CalMatters does work that covers the breadth of California, but we need more of it, right? We need a lot more resourcing. And I think that's ultimately what's exciting about the redistricting work, is you have these communities of interest that are getting activated and really, you know, trying to articulate who they are and what they represent, and however the districts get drawn, they have to take their needs and concerns first and foremost. So just really, you know, honored to be here with all of you. And I look forward to seeing the recording of the parts that I missed, because I'm sure there was a lot that was shared that's going to be very profound. So I think that's it. I guess, do I close it, Karla? Am I closing it?
We can close it together. This has been I think everybody's just kind of wondering, and I feel like I'm going to hang up right now and I'm going to go straight to all those numbers. I can't wait. It's like Christmas morning, but not really. I don't know. I'm a little conflicted. But thank you so much to all of the panelists for being here with us, for the support for Census Legacies, for the support to the trusted messengers that have a long, long way to go 2030. We're going to be there together, and we're going to build these stronger communities, starting with this momentum that we have today. We should feel inspired.
So there is one, so there's a factual question about which counties have the highest hard to count index. So, you know, some of this we need to see, it's not just hard to count index, we can look at the self-response rate on that. So we can get back to you on that. But John, there's a question here that you might be able to answer in terms of redistricting data. How do people get access to it? Do they need to be involved in census before, or is there some other process in which they could get access to it? John, are you, there you go.
Yeah, I'm here. I want to try to understand the question better. So will partner groups working on redistricting who are previously actively working on census get resources and data automatically? What data, depends on what data you're referring to. I don't think anyone will get data automatically. You can certainly reach out to me or CSI. I'm sure they're looped in, and so I don't know if you're referring to the data that the state's getting or data that organizations are going to be using to do their work. So you can certainly reach out to me or Karthick or Karla at CSI, and we can clarify that for you. In terms of resources, Tara, I don't think it's automatic. I don't, Tara, you want to jump in there about resources?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think unlike the census itself, which had a very robust public sector investment of $187 million, that is not going to be the case for redistricting. And on the private philanthropy side, there are a smaller number of foundations that are prioritizing redistricting. You know, census brings a lot of people to the table. Redistricting necessarily at this point narrows the field. And so the resources of the Fair Redistricting Fund, as I understand it, have already been deployed. I know that continued fundraising continues to identify, but I don't think any community group who was funded by the census should automatically expect that there will be resources for them for redistricting. But what I encourage every community group to do is to talk with your funders, you know, let them know what your priorities are, and identify if there are resources within current grants or the next grant to be able to support your work. So I hope that helps.
Just wanted to point out that there is a resource in the chat from Eric has shared that California Common Cause has some really good resources for redistricting.
And actually, let me just add, because I
saw
California
too. Yeah, a lot of research.
I see that the question Anna asked the question and is with CCAEJ. I strongly encourage you to speak with Sky or Michael at Inland Empowerment.
Yeah, they are you know, part of the strong regional leads on that work. So thank you, John, for lifting that up. So we are a little bit over time. So thank you everyone for joining us, and look forward to. Unfortunately, I have another meeting, so I can't run to the data the way Hans looks like he's about to break away and just kind of start sifting through. But thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as we go through redistricting to help inform the public conversation. Thank you.